we're starting with here is something quite early, going all the way back to 1680, but actually earlier than that. And it's not possible for me to cover all of the things that we could possibly cover and all of the people that have been affected by colonialism or the things that happened here in North America or around the world. So for anyone that is a member of any of those cultures that are left out of this discussion today, please note that this is focused and that this is a specific topic that I'm trying to address today. And absolutely, there are many different tribes and regions that were affected across the whole world, and this is just one specific example thereof. And I apologize if you were not included in this discussion, but it was impossible to include everyone, and this presentation would have been going on for weeks otherwise. So thank you again for being here, and let's go ahead and get started. So one thing I want to show you here is a map of the pre-colonial North American Southwest. This is something that you don't see typically in history anymore, and there's a reason for that, because it doesn't fit the narrative of what people want people to think about when it comes to American history. The reality is North American history is far longer and much more extensive than that of just the United States. And the reality is that this is not taught in the way that it should be, and that is a great deficiency in our understanding of the world and a better knowledge of it. So here we have a map of just the southwestern part of the U.S. superimposed over, the current United States: Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, etc. And in that regard, we see three specific nations of indigenous people, although there are far more than that. These are very gross generalizations, and these groups were also broken up into smaller subdivisions as well. But down here in Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, etc., you see the Hohokam, centered on the middle Gila River and lower Salt River drainage areas, extending into the southern Sonoran Desert, believed to have emerged at approximately 200 CE. These people lived in smaller settlement clusters than their neighbors, but built extensive irrigation canals for a wide range of agricultural crops. Southeast of that, you see the Mogollon, who lived in the Southwest from around the same time, 200 CE, up until somewhere around 1450 or 1540 CE. Mogollon archaeological sites are found in the Gila Wilderness, the River Valley, Upper Gila River, and the low mountains between the Franklin Mountains west and the Hueco Mountains to the east. Predominantly, what we're going to be speaking about today is northeast of us, the ancestral Puebloans, or sometimes also refers to as the Anasazi, was centered around present-day Four Corners area. Their distinctive pottery and dwelling construction styles emerged at around 750 CE, so this is quite a while ago. This is a map, a 1963 archaeological map of just some of the Hohokam canal systems just south of Phoenix near present-day Coolidge. These canal systems were extensive, indicative of an advanced agriculturally based society. Many of these areas are still inhabited, and today what are likely are the descendants of the Hohokam, but that is not entirely clear. But what is clear is how extensive that society was, along with ruins that exist still to this day. I mean, if you look at this and you're familiar with Arizona, maybe you're visiting this presentation from somewhere else, but if you live here, Coolidge is just between Tucson and Phoenix. And if you look at this, there is a nest of lines and maps and processes here that were all irrigation ditches by the Hohokam and continued to be used extensively for a long time. They learned how to make this desert an inhabitable place and grow tepary beans and other types of indigenous foods and sustain themselves in an agriculturally based society. That type of agriculturally based society has an effect later in this discussion, along with the Anasazi or the Puebloans, and we'll see more about that later in the presentation. Here you see the Hohokam in, and of course, an artistic rendering, probably near what would be modern-day Casa Grande. And on the bottom right is an actually still existing Hohokam irrigation ditch in the Phoenix area. These irrigation ditches were so extensive that they still exist today. And a lot of Phoenix is actually architected around those existing systems. So Phoenix pretty much exists today because of what the Hohokam did before white settlers came here to turn it into something else. And those irrigation ditches made Phoenix a possibility. These are the ruins of Casa Grande. You can see at the bottom an artistic rendering. Once again, the Hohokam. But these were not primitive societies. They were extensively and advanced societies that figured out how to live in a very hostile desert like we live in here today, but without the modern amenities. They did it with agriculture and understanding the environment in a way that I'd say that, frankly, a lot of us don't now. But if you look at these ruins, and these are, of course, just ruins now, and then look at the diagram below, these were extensive civilizations with entire cities, really, by modern standards. But coming back to our map, northeast of the Hohokam, we find the Anasazi, or the ancestral Puebloans. Up there on the top right, You'll see Santa Fe, Las Vegas, Chaco Canyon, which was an epicenter of the Puebloan civilization. More of that coming. We mentioned the extensive and advanced complex canal systems of the Hohokam and the trade routes of the Hohokam earlier, but the Anasazi were probably even more so. This map is just part of modern New Mexico, and it gives a hint of the magnitude of how significant the Puebloan civilization was. Each and every one of those dots on there that states a Pueblo is a huge complex of very long-standing and surviving indigenous peoples, villages, and cities that still to this day are inhabited. This is the Acoma, sometimes referred to as Sky City, has been inhabited for over 2,000 years. And you can still visit this today, in fact. A number of these pueblos in New Mexico are open to some level of public visitation on specific days or with specific constraints. But it tells you really how resilient the Puebloan people have been. But first, we got to talk about Spanish colonialism if we're going to get to the point of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. And what were the purposes and intentions of Spanish colonialism? And I think we all kind of know this, but we have to make these settings down. We have to set this down in stone for we understand why they were coming here. One was, of course, to extract gold and silver from the Americas. The other was perhaps maybe they thought they were actually doing this, or it was an excuse, convert the indigenous people to Christianity. But of course, the third and most important thing they were looking for, slave labor or enslaving people to their needs and goals. Christopher Columbus, 1492, and we have this glamorized artwork of him here arriving. He was an Italian navigator, but he was sponsored by the Catholic monarchs of Spain. He actually landed in the Caribbean. One of the very first indigenous peoples victimized by Spanish colonialism and Columbus were the Taino. Columbus stated upon meeting them in the Bahamas in 1492, they were very well built with very handsome bodies and very good faces. They do not carry arms or know them. They should be good servants, and I think they can be very easily be made into Christians. As you can see, very first landing in 1492, the principles of what Spanish colonialism was here for and what it was to be were set. The Taino had a rich society as well of agriculture, villages, art, music, and religion based on ancestor worship. The Taino were almost made extinct. They still exist to this day, and there is a significant part of them represented in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican people today. But their society was fairly demolished by Spanish colonialism. Columbus demanded a certain amount of gold or cotton from each Taino over the age of 13. When they did not meet his quota, he had them cut up into pieces like sheep, run down by hunting dogs, torn to pieces, strung up and burned alive, sometimes 13 at a time, in memory of Jesus and his 12 apostles. The Spanish divided the remaining Tainos amongst themselves to teach them the Christian faith. And here we see, of course, a rendering of those 13 people strung up and eventually burned alive in memory of Jesus and his 12 apostles. And Christopher Columbus, a quote from him directly, "With 50 men, we could subjugate them all, make them do whatever we want." There was resistance, but little chance of success. Hatui, the Taino king of Cuba, told his people to throw their gold into the river because the Christians worship gold as their god and would kill them for it. In 1512, when Hatui was about to be burned at the stake, pictured here, a Franciscan brother told him about the Christian faith to save his soul. When Hatui found out that most good Christians were going to heaven, he specifically told them he chose hell. 90% of the Taino population died or were killed over only a few brief years due to genocide and disease. Due to the Taino susceptibility of smallpox, African slaves were imported to the Caribbean to replace the labor force, starting the transatlantic slave trade. So here we see the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. After the Taino were essentially eradicated, Africans were enslaved as people and seen as a renewable and expendable source of slave labor. This map shows the Spanish colonial endeavors up to including 1810. Once you destroy and subjugate the people and resources of one region, they merely moved on to another region, repeat the cycle. Colonialism is ravenous and parasitic. You can see at the bottom right, of course, Santo Domingo, Cuba, the Caribbean, where Columbus landed in 1492. But by 1810, Spain had moved its empire and its colonialism across the entire North American continent. And each and every one of these regions represents people or peoples that were oppressed by this regime. And now we start getting to the reality of what formed the Revolt of 1680. Juan de Oñate. If you're following local and current events right now, a statue of Juan Oñate was currently removed in New Mexico. And it's this astonishing to think about the fact that a statue of this man was represented at this time and place, but we are in a situation we are, aren't we? Spanish conquistador, following up on the previous efforts of Coronado. Coronado moved up through Mexico and opened up, essentially had an unsuccessful campaign through the North American continent. But Juan de Oñate took what Coronado did and moved upon it. The specified goals of Oñate's mission was, quote unquote, to save souls. But in reality, the true goals were the continuation of colonialism, control, subjugation, exploitation of indigenous people, resources, and deliberate cultural genocide. Here's the route of Oñate. He started off in New Mexico City and headed north. And if you look at this, thinking about this as 1598, this was quite an endeavor founded by one of the largest and most powerful nation states in the world, the Spanish Empire. All the way from Mexico City through modern-day Santa Fe, as far north as the San Juan Pueblo. Oñate brought with him Catholic priests, divided what was then Nuevo Mexico into 7 regions, dispatching priests to each of those 7 regions. These regions, of course, had their own indigenous religion, and these people and these different tribal entities and nations had their own religion. The Puebloan people had a rich and ancient existing belief system, much of it focused on spirits called kachina, and represented by dancers and dolls. You'll see here today these. And if you're ever in the Southwest, these kachina dolls are a fairly common thing that you'll encounter. Sometimes culturally usurped or frequently culturally usurped, Kokapelli being the most exemplary example of that. But the reality is the kachinas represent spirits of nature and their ancestors. I can't get into that religion too deeply now because it's, of course, very rich and realized. But kachina dolls are a very important part of the Puebloan, Hopi, and other religious belief systems of the Southwest. Here we see a kiva, and this is artwork representing a kiva. Kiva is a special sacred building, usually built underground, that was used for spiritual ceremonies, religious rituals, and ceremonial preparations by the Pueblo Native Americans, and strongly associated with the Kachina belief system. Kivas consisted of circular chambers built almost wholly underground with an entrance through a hatchway on the top. A ladder, made with long poles pointing skyward, was used to access the hatchway. Prayer sticks were prepared in the kivas and used for various rituals and ceremonies, including kachina dolls, for calling forth spirits and the evocation of a prayer. Kivas were symbolic of the entry to the fourth world, the present world, and the hatchways symbolized the emergence from other worlds, the home of the kachina spirits. Here's an example of an existing kiva today, and many small kivas are scattered amongst every Pueblo village, each one being a place of sacred gathering for the neighborhood, for lack of a better term. However, they weren't all small. This is an example of a great kiva. A few of Franciscan priests tolerated traditional religious practices as long as the Puebloans attended Mass and maintained a public veneer of Catholicism. This is the great kiva of Aztec, New Mexico. And if you see inside, it truly is a beautiful sacred space. There are sacred gathering spaces, and this restored great kiva in Aztec, New Mexico presents that very appropriately. However, other priests were not so tolerant, and they established totalitarian theocracies in their designated provinces, characterized by ruthless suppression of religious practices and persistent abuse of Pueblo labor. The priests destroyed kivas, forbade ceremonial practices, desecrated or destroyed sacred objects. Here we see another great kiva in its destroyed, ruinous state. The Pueblos frequently rose up against their oppressors. These uprisings usually involved a handful of Pueblos with insufficient warriors and weapons to be successful. The Spanish authorities often discovered and ruthlessly crushed rebellions before they could organize effectively. They then killed the dissidents and sold them as slaves. 1598. Zutkapan, an Acoma spiritual leader, learned that the Spanish intended to conquer Acoma, the Acoma Pueblo by force. He also learned that the Spanish plan was to have all the Pueblo people move to a new village in the valley. They would be living under Spanish rule, working as enslaved people under the crown. Additionally, his people would also be forced to convert to Catholicism, forsake their traditional beliefs and practices. Seeking to protect the Pueblo's material and religious integrity, the Pueblo's leadership decided to resist. Initially, 12 Spaniards were killed in this first act of defiance. In this picture here, you can see the Acoma Pueblo still today. It is a site that is still inhabited and visitable. When Oñate learned of the incident, he ordered an expedition to punish the Acoma and set an example for other Pueblos. About 70 men arrived at Acoma on January 21st, 1599. For 2 days, the Acoma people were able to defend their Pueblo, But on the third day, the conquistadors opened fire with a cannon and broke their defenses. There were an estimated 6,000 people living at or around the Acoma Pueblo in 1599. At least 2,000 of them were warriors. An estimated 500 men were killed in the battle, with approximately 300 women and children. Some 500 prisoners were taken and later sentenced by Oñate. Oñate ordered that every male above the age of 25 would have his right foot cut off, and that person be enslaved for a period of 20 years. Males between the age of 12 and 25 were also enslaved for 20 years, along with all females above the age of 12. Most of these youths were dispersed among the residences of government officials or at Franciscan missions. 60 of the youngest women were not deemed guilty and were sent to Mexico City, where they were parceled out amongst Catholic covenants. 2 Hopi men were taken prisoner at the Pueblo. After each one had his hand cut off, they were released to spread the word of Spain's might. 1660, Inquisition, and the seal of the Inquisition here on the bottom right. Mendizabal served as governor of New Mexico between 1659 and 1660. He attempted to actually curtail the powers of the priests, prohibiting them from forcing the native population to work for free, and acknowledged the right of the indigenous people to worship according to their traditions, including performing the sacred dances performed or banned by the Franciscans, which you can see here in the artwork on the left. As a result, of course, he was in power for 1 year. By being somewhat noble, or a little more noble to the indigenous people, the Spanish Inquisition literally convicted him of heresy and condemned him based on 33 counts of malfeasance and the practice of Judaism. So here we see anti-Semitism raising its head here in Spanish colonialism as well. All right, 1645 to the 1670s, a lot of things are going wrong. Famine, oppression, and the beginning of Navajo and Apache raids. Drought and unusually high temperatures in the 1660s and 1670s made life increasingly difficult. All of the indigenous people, whether they were Puebloan, Apache, Navajo, or Comanche, were starving. Apache, Navajo, and Comanche were starting to enter the Puebloan lands as hunter-gatherers, and they were not agriculturally based. But when starvation hit everyone, they saw the Pueblos as a resource to raid. Raiding parties became a frequent and persistent problem for the Pueblos, ravaging communities beset by famine. The Spanish soldiers and Pueblo warriors could not quell the attacks. The Spanish exacerbated the tension by seizing the crops and possessions, leaving the Pueblos with nothing at all. Pueblos attributed their hardships and their prolonged drought on the disruption of their religious practices. The estimated Puebloan population in the year 1500 was around 80,000. This number dropped to approximately 15,000 by the late 1600s. We're talking just over 100 years, almost 75,000 people dead. 1675, Governor Juan Francisco Trevino ordered the arrest of 47 Pueblo medicine men. Those were the religious leaders. He ordered his troops to burn the kivas and the idols and accuse them of witchcraft. 4 were to be hung, and 3 executions were carried out. The 4th man committed suicide. The remaining prisoners were publicly whipped and sentenced to slavery and servitude. Still 1675, 70 warriors descend upon the governor's office in Santa Fe demanding the release of the remaining prisoners. They forced the governor to concede because his troops were far from Santa Fe fighting Apaches. By the way, the Palace of the Governors, erected in 1605, still is there in Santa Fe, New Mexico today, and you can see it. So in a very early modern example of American civil disobedience, these 70 warriors surrounded the governor's palace and forced him to release the prisoners. And here we see coming onto the scene a man named Pope. He was a Tewa religious leader. Pope was one of the prisoners released, and after his release, he retreated to the Taos Pueblo. The Taos Pueblo was the northernmost and therefore the most remote Pueblo in the Spanish Empire. Pope began to organize and plan a rebellion with the goal of driving the Spanish from the the Anasazi ancestral lands, eradicate their influence, and return to a traditional way of life. Using the Taos Pueblo as his home base, Pope travels for 5 years from 1675 to 1680 to garner and unite the other Pueblos in an uprising. Ironically, these Pueblos didn't necessarily have a unifying language until Spanish colonialism, and by the year 1680, all the Puebloans spoke Spanish. Pope dispatched runners to all of the Pueblos carrying knotted cords. He instructed Pueblo leaders to untie 1 knot from the cord each morning. When the last knot was untied, that would be the day for them to rise up against the Spanish in unison. Pope's orders: burn the church, kill the resident priest, kill the Spanish settlers, and converge on Santa Fe and kill or expel all Spanish settlers. He wasn't kidding around. August 10th, 1680. The Spanish intercepted 2 of the runners on August 9th, and they tortured them until they revealed the significance of the knotted cord. The leaders of the rebellion realized that their plan had been compromised, so they started the revolt the following day, August 10th. They dispatched runners with new instructions, but the Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi didn't get the memo in time due to the vast distances, and they adhered to the original plan. By August 11th, the revolt was in full swing. Pueblo warriors destroyed all of the Spanish settlements in the province by August 13th, and they converged on the capital of Santa Fe. Almost 1,000 Spanish people sought sanctuary in the governor's palace by August 15th, surrounded by an army of over 2,500 Puebloan warriors. August 21st, the Spanish break out of the governor's palace. They launch a costly counterattack to drive the warriors away from the city, which gave them time to flee. And they begin a long trek south to escape Nuevo Mexico. The Puebloan warriors shadowed them the entire way, essentially escorting them back to the border. And in an example of amazing kindness, they did not attack. They let them escape. This revolt cost 400 Spanish lives, including 21 of the 33 priests in New Mexico. Approximately 2,000 Spanish colonists survived. Pope orders the Pueblos to destroy all crosses, churches, and Christian images. They order the people to cleanse themselves in ritual baths, to use their Pueblo names, and destroy all vestiges of the Roman Catholic religion, Spanish culture, including Spanish livestock and fruit trees. Some of the Puebloans resisted his effort to rule, and he was considered a tyrant by some of them. There were some of them that had sincerely converted to Christianity, and some of them that had family or friends who were Spanish. The Pueblo Council deposed Pope about a year after the revolt, but he was reelected shortly before his death in 1688. The confederation between the Pueblos fell apart after he died. Opposition to Spanish rule gave the Pueblos the incentive to unite, but not the means to remain united once their common enemy had been vanquished. For 12 years, the Pueblos prevented the Spanish from returning, successfully repelling attempts in 1681 and 1687. However, continuous drought, famine, and raids by the Apache and Navajo continued to take a toll on the Pueblo people. In 1692, Diego de Vargas was able to reclaim Nuevo Mexico for Spain, but things had changed a little bit for the better. They built new churches, and here you can see at the Pueblo National Monument, or in New Mexico, the ruins of one of those churches with the artist rendition of it to the left. The association between the Spanish and the Puebloans was now more biased towards cooperation than subjugation. However, the Puebloans now had an uncomfortable peace between two groups. Here in this video, we walk through the ruins of the last second church. The Puebloan people's homes closest to the mission were friendly to the Spaniards and probably had converted to the Catholic faith. It's fascinating when you walk through these ruins to know that that floor right there is where indigenous people were subjugated by the Catholic faith, and that these ruins still exist to this day based on Spanish colonialism and what they represent. So right there would have been where the priest would have stood in front of his quote-unquote congregation, and to the left is where the priest would have come out in some sort of pomp and circumstance right here through this doorway to make himself seem more important than he truly was. And of course, an exit out to the south. Here we are on the more northern extent of the Pueblo, and this is where the people who were probably not converted to Catholicism or were not friendly to the Spanish existed. And in this video, you see instead of a giant mission, a kiva. So right there are the ruins of an original indigenous kiva. And way off in the distance there, you can see the ruins of the Catholic mission. And so really the Puebloan society was split, people that were friendly to the Spanish and Catholicism and those who were not. The Franciscan priests returning to Nuevo Mexico altered their approach, becoming more tolerant of indigenous religious expression. Pueblo warriors and Spanish soldiers actually, in some instances, became allies in the fight against a now common enemy, the Apache, the Navajo, the Ute, and the Comanche. If it wasn't for this revolt, however, and early resistance to Christianity, there is no doubt that the Puebloan beliefs, their culture, their religion, and they themselves would have been eradicated. Feast days are held every day at the still inhabited pueblos, and even some of the pueblos that are not. This video below, which I'm going to play in a moment, is Feast Day from 2019 at the Pecos National Park, right near the ruins of the video you just saw a moment ago, and near the first mission destroyed in 1680 during the Revolt. These people marched in the footsteps of their ancestors. They also have restored magnificent kivas here, as well as the pueblos, that are used to this day by people in the practice of their indigenous faith. I'd like to finish this presentation with one very poignant addition, and that is that of a new Kachina spirit which came about due to the 1680 revolt, and that is that of Yawa, the priest killer. Legend states that a Hopi man named Yawa killed and beheaded a Franciscan priest during the revolt. After this incident, the Hopi referred to Yawa as the priest killer, or as an ogre Kachina that had the power to punish others. You see here two versions of him presented as a Kachina. I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope you found this interesting, enlightening, and inspiring. And it is something to see that an indigenous people, under hundreds of years of oppression, have still been able to retain their religious faith and their belief system and their culture against all odds and adversity. And we see them still today practicing in kivas and as well as in Catholic missions.